The thunderous sound of tires screeching echoed through the eerily quiet suburban streets as James' car lurched to a sudden stop, barely avoiding a collision with the HOA patrol vehicle blocking his driveway. Heart pounding, he slammed the gear shift into park and threw open the door, storming towards the imposing figure of Mrs. Livingston, the HOA president, standing smugly beside the flashing lights. "What is the meaning of this, Livingston?" James demanded, his voice dripping with barely contained rage. "You have no right to—" "Ah, Mr. Blackwood," Livingston interrupted, a twisted smile playing across her lips. "I was wondering when you'd show up. You're in violation of Section 7, Paragraph 12 of the HOA bylaws. Unauthorized parking in a restricted zone." James felt the blood drain from his face as he glanced down at the bright orange ticket fluttering in Livingston's hand. This was no minor infraction. The fine was astronomical, more than he could afford. His mind raced, desperately searching for a way out of this nightmare. "You can't do this," he protested, his voice cracking with desperation. "I was only gone for a few minutes to—" "To what, Mr. Blackwood?" Livingston's eyes narrowed, her tone dripping with malice. "Run an errand? Visiting a friend? I'm afraid that simply doesn't matter. The rules are the rules, and you've broken them. The fine will be deducted from your account immediately." James opened his mouth to argue, but the ominous sound of a tow truck rumbling down the street made his blood run cold. Livingston's gaze shifted to the approaching vehicle, a twisted smile spreading across her face. "Ah, and it appears your car will be impounded as well. How unfortunate." She turned to leave, pausing for a moment to glance back at James. "I do hope you have a lovely evening, Mr. Blackwood. Perhaps next time you'll think twice before disregarding our community's regulations." As the tow truck driver approached, James frantically tried to plead his case, but Livingston had already vanished, leaving him helpless and alone to face the consequences of his supposed transgression. Despair and rage battled for dominance within him, and he clenched his fists, knowing that he was trapped in a web of deceit and power-hungry machinations. But just as the tow truck driver began to hitch James' car, a familiar figure came rushing down the street, waving frantically. "Stop! Stop!" the woman yelled, her voice frantic. "Don't tow that car." James' eyes widened in surprise as Karen, his neighbor and the only person in the entire neighborhood who dared to defy Livingston's tyrannical rule, hurried to intervene. "What's the meaning of this, Karen?" the tow truck driver asked, clearly confused by the interruption. "That car belongs to my friend," Karen explained breathlessly. "I told him to park there while I went to the store. It's my fault, not his. Please, you have to let him go." The tow truck driver glanced uncertainly between Karen and the still fuming Livingston, who had returned to the scene, her eyes narrowed in suspicion. "I'm afraid that won't be necessary," Livingston declared, her voice dripping with false concern. "Mr. Blackwood has already been issued a citation, and the fine will be deducted from his account. There's no need for any further action." As the tow truck driver reluctantly pulled away, James felt a mixture of relief and bewilderment. Had Karen, of all people, just saved him from Livingston's malicious scheme? The realization that the HOA president had been deliberately trying to trap him sent a chill down his spine, and he knew that this was only the beginning of battle against a powerful and corrupt entity that would stop at nothing to maintain its grip on the community. James stared in stunned silence as Karen approached, her brow furrowed with concern. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice low and urgent. "I saw Livingston hassling you and knew I had to do something." James shook his head, still trying to process the whirlwind of events. I don't understand. Why would Livingston try to have my car towed? And how did you know to intervene?" Karen glanced around nervously, her eyes darting to the now empty street. "It's a long story, but Livingston has been targeting residents who don't follow her rules to the letter. She uses the HOA's power to harass and intimidate anyone who dares to challenge her." James felt a chill run down his spine. But why? What does she have to gain from all of this? Karen's expression darkened. Control, plain and simple. Livingston is obsessed with maintaining her grip on this community, and she'll stop at nothing to do it. The fines, the threats, the towing. It's all part of her twisted game. Anger began to simmer within James as the gravity of the situation sank in. So she was trying to trap me, to punish me for some imagined infraction. Karen nodded solemnly. Exactly. And if I hadn't been here to stop the tow truck, you'd be out a whole lot of money, not to mention the hassle of getting your car back. James clenched his fists, his mind racing with a mixture of fury and determination. This can't go on. We have to do something, Karen. We have to stop her. Karen's eyes widened, and she quickly shook her head. No, James, you don't understand. Livingston is powerful, and she has the entire HOA board in her pocket. Trying to take her on directly would be suicide. Then what do you suggest we do? James demanded, his frustration mounting. Just roll over and let her continue to terrorize the entire neighborhood. Karen's expression hardened, and she leaned in closer, her voice barely above a whisper. There is a way, but it's risky. Livingston has been using the HOA's resources to line her own pockets, and I think I know how to expose her corruption. James felt a glimmer of hope ignite within him. What do you have in mind? First, we need to gather evidence, Karen explained, her eyes darting around nervously. Livingston keeps meticulous records of the HOA's finances, but she's careful to cover her tracks. We need to find a way to get our hands on those records without her knowing. James nodded, his mind already whirring with possibilities. Okay, and then what? Then we take it to the authorities, Karen said, her voice trembling with both fear and determination. If we can prove that Livingston has been embezzling HOA funds for her own personal gain, we might be able to get her removed from office and hold her accountable for her actions. The plan was risky, but James knew that it was their only chance to take down the HOA's tyrannical ruler. He steeled himself, his resolve hardening. All right, Karen, let's do this. As the two neighbors set off to uncover Livingston's dark secrets, the weight of their mission hung heavy in the air. They knew that they were up against a powerful and ruthless adversary, one who would stop at nothing to maintain her grip on the community. But with determination burning in their hearts, they were ready to face the challenge head-on, no matter the cost. The dimly lit hallway of the HOA office felt oppressive and foreboding as James and Karen cautiously made their way towards Livingston's private study. The sound of their footsteps echoed ominously, and a sense of unease settled in the pit of James' stomach. Are you sure about this, Karen? He whispered, his eyes darting nervously. What if we get caught? Karen's expression was steely and resolute. We don't have a choice, James. If we want to take Livingston down, we need those financial records. Reaching the ornate wooden door, Karen paused for a moment, her hand hovering over the handle. Remember, we need to be quick and quiet. Livingston could return at any moment. With a deep breath, she gently pushed the door open, and the two of them slipped inside the study. The room was a study in contrast. The plush, expensive furnishings juxtaposed with the impersonal, clinical atmosphere. James couldn't help but feel a sense of unease as his gaze swept across the neatly organized shelves and the meticulously maintained files. All right, let's start searching, Karen whispered, already moving towards the filing cabinet in the corner. James nodded and began to carefully examine the contents of Livingston's desk, his heart pounding in his chest. The minutes ticked by, and the tension in the room grew palpable as they rifled through documents, searching for any sign of financial irregularities. Suddenly, a loud creak from the hallway outside made them freeze, their eyes locked on the door in terror. Footsteps approached, and James felt his breath catch in his throat. Quickly, hide, Karen hissed, gesturing towards a small closet in the corner. Without a moment's hesitation, they slipped inside, crouching down and holding their breath as the door to the study creaked open. James could feel his heart racing, the sound of his own pulse pounding in his ears as the sound of Livingston's heels clicked across the hardwood floor. "I know you're in here, you meddlesome fools," she snarled, her voice dripping with venom. "You can't hide from me." James could feel Karen's hand tightening around his arm, her nails digging into his skin as Livingston's footsteps drew closer. The seconds ticked by like hours, and James was sure that the pounding of his heart would give them away. Just when he thought they were surely doomed, the sound of Livingston's phone ringing echoed through the study, and she let out an irritated huff. "This isn't over," she growled, before striding out of the room, her phone pressed to her ear. James and Karen waited in tense silence for several long minutes, listening as Livingston's voice faded into the distance. Finally, Karen slowly pushed the closet door open, her face pale and drawn. "That was too close," she whispered, her voice shaking. James nodded, his own hands trembling slightly. Did you find anything?" Karen's expression darkened. "Yes, and it's worse than we thought. Livingston has been systematically embezzling funds from the HOA, diverting them into her own personal accounts. The amount of money we're talking about is staggering." James felt a chill run down his spine. "So what do we do now?" "Now," Karen said, her voice laced with determination, "we take this to the authorities. Livingston's reign of terror ends here." As they slipped out of the study and made their way back towards the exit, James couldn't help but feel a sense of both dread and anticipation. They had uncovered Livingston's dark secrets, but he knew that the battle was far from over. The HOA president would stop at nothing to protect her power, and they were about to unleash a tidal wave of chaos that would shake the very foundations of their community. The fluorescent lights of the police station cast a harsh, clinical glow over the small room where James and Karen sat, their hands trembling as they handed over the incriminating financial documents they had uncovered. "This is a very serious accusation," the detective said, his brow furrowed as he meticulously examined the evidence. "You're telling me that the HOA president has been embezzling funds for her own personal gain?" James nodded, his mouth suddenly dried. "Yes, that's exactly what we're saying. The records are all there. The money has been systematically diverted into Livingston's private accounts." The detective's eyes narrowed as he continued to flip through the pages, his expression growing graver with each passing moment. This is a lot of money we're talking about. Hundreds of thousands of dollars, if not more." Karen leaned forward, her voice tinged with urgency. "You have to do something, detective. Livingston has been terrorizing our entire community, using the HOA's power to intimidate and control us. We can't let her get away with this." The detective let out a heavy sigh, setting the documents down on the table. "I understand your concerns, but this is a serious matter that will require a thorough investigation. We'll need to gather more evidence, interview witnesses, and build a solid case before we can move forward." James felt his heart sink. But what about the HOA? Livingston could continue her reign of terror while you're investigating. The detective's expression hardened. "I understand your frustration, but the legal process takes time. In the meantime, I would advise you and your neighbors to document any further instances of harassment or abuse of power by the HOA. That will only strengthen our case." Karen opened her mouth to protest, but the detective raised a hand, silencing her. "I know this is difficult, but you've done the right thing by coming forward. We'll do everything in our power to bring Livingston to justice." As they left the police station, the weight of the situation seemed to settle heavily on James' shoulders. He couldn't shake the feeling that Livingston would stop at nothing to maintain her grip on the community, and he knew that they were treading on dangerous ground. "Do you really think the police will be able to do anything?" he asked, his voice tinged with doubt. Karen's expression was grim. "I hope so, but Livingston has deep pockets and powerful connections. We may have to take matters into our own hands if the authorities don't move quickly enough." James felt a chill run down his spine. "What are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting that we rally the rest of the community," Karen said, her eyes burning with determination. If we can get enough people to stand up to Livingston and the HOA, we might be able to force their hand. But what if they retaliate? James asked, his voice trembling. You said yourself that Livingston will stop at nothing to protect her power. Karen's expression hardened. Then we'll be ready. We can't let her continue to terrorize us, James. It's time to fight back. As they made their way back to their respective homes, James couldn't help but feel a sense of dread and apprehension. The battle lines had been drawn, and he knew that the war against the HOA's corruption was only just beginning. The air was thick with tension as the gathered homeowners of the quiet suburban community shuffled nervously in the dimly lit community center. James scanned the faces of his neighbors, many of whom he recognized from his daily routines, but now their expressions were etched with a palpable sense of unease and fear. Karen stepped forward, her voice ringing out with a newfound authority. Thank you all for coming. I know you're probably wondering why I've gathered you here today, but I assure you, it's for a very good reason. She paused, her gaze sweeping across the crowd. Our community is in grave danger. The HOA, under the leadership of President Livingston, has been systematically abusing its power, using fear and intimidation to control us all. Murmurs of agreement and shock rippled through the crowd, and James felt a surge of solidarity. Finally, their neighbors were beginning to see the truth. But it's worse than that, Karen continued, her voice lowering to a solemn tone. We have uncovered evidence that Livingston has been embezzling HOA funds for her own personal gain. Hundreds of thousands of dollars stolen right from under our noses. The crowd erupted in outraged cries, and James could see the anger and betrayal etched on their faces. He knew that this was the moment they had been waiting for. The moment to finally stand up and fight back against the tyranny that had been oppressing them for far too long. We've taken this evidence to the police, Karen said, raising her hands to calm the crowd. But we all know that Livingston has powerful connections, and the wheels of justice can move painfully slow. That's why we need to take action ourselves. James felt a wave of unease wash over him, but he pressed on, his voice steady and resolute. Livingston and the HOA won't give up their power without a fight. We need to be prepared for their retaliation, and that means we need to stand united as a community. The crowd murmured in agreement, and James could see the determination in their eyes. We need to document every instance of harassment, intimidation, or abuse of power. We need to rally our neighbors, and we need to make our voices heard. Only then can we hope to bring Livingston and the HOA down for good. As the meeting drew to a close, James could feel the weight of their mission pressing down on him. He knew that they were about to embark on a dangerous and unpredictable battle, one that could have far-reaching consequences for their entire community. But as he watched his neighbors file out, their eyes alight with a newfound sense of purpose, he couldn't help but feel a glimmer of hope. Perhaps, with their combined strength and determination, they could finally break the HOA's stranglehold and reclaim their homes and their lives. The road ahead would be long and arduous, but James was ready to face it head-on. He knew that the stakes were high, and the consequences of failure were unthinkable. But in that moment, surrounded by the unwavering resolve of his neighbors, he felt a surge of courage and confidence. They were going to win this fight, no matter the cost. The silence in the courtroom was deafening as the judge's gavel came down with a resounding thud, signaling the start of the long-awaited trial against Livingston and the corrupt HOA. James sat in the front row, his heart pounding in his chest, as the prosecutor stood and began to lay out the damning evidence that he and Karen had uncovered. One by one, the financial records were presented, showing a systematic pattern of embezzlement and fraud that stretched back for years. The tension in the room was palpable as the jury members listened intently, their expressions ranging from shock to outrage. James couldn't help but feel a sense of grim satisfaction as Livingston's carefully constructed facade of respectability began to crumble before their eyes. But just as the prosecution seemed to be gaining the upper hand, Livingston's high-powered legal team took the floor, launching a blistering counterattack. These accusations are nothing more than baseless rumors and hearsay, the lead attorney, a slick-talking individual with a shark-like grin, declared. My client has dedicated her life to this community, and these so-called homeowners are simply trying to undermine her hard work and commitment. James felt his blood boil as the attorney went on to paint him and Karen as disgruntled troublemakers, intent on bringing down a pillar of the community out of pure spite. The financial records presented by the prosecution have been taken out of context and misinterpreted, the attorney continued, his voice dripping with disdain. The money in question was used for necessary improvements and maintenance, all in accordance with the HOA bylaws. The jury seemed to be swayed by the attorney's smooth rhetoric, and James could see the doubt creeping into their expressions. He glanced over at Karen, whose face was a mask of barely contained fury. This is a witch hunt, pure and simple, the attorney concluded, his gaze sweeping across the courtroom. My client is the victim here, and we intend to prove it beyond a reasonable doubt. As the proceedings dragged on, James felt his hope beginning to waver. Livingston's legal team was relentless, and they seemed to have an answer for every piece of evidence presented by the prosecution. But just when all seemed lost, a familiar face took the stand, the tow truck driver who had been poised to impound James' car on that fateful night. The man's testimony was damning, describing in vivid detail how Livingston had personally instructed him to tow James' vehicle, despite Karen's intervention. He recounted how Livingston had threatened him with retribution if he didn't comply, and how he had reluctantly gone along with her scheme, fearing the consequences. As the jury listened, transfixed, the prosecutor pounced, grilling the tow truck driver on the specifics of his interactions with Livingston. The man's account was unwavering, and it painted a chilling picture of the HOA president's willingness to abuse her power for personal gain. James felt a surge of hope as the tide began to turn in their favor. Livingston's carefully constructed facade was crumbling, and the jury seemed to be firmly on their side. But as the trial drew to a close, James couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. He knew that Livingston was a formidable opponent, and he couldn't shake the feeling that she had one final ace up her sleeve. As the judge called for a brief recess, James leaned over to Karen, his voice low and urgent. Do you get the feeling that this is all just a setup? That Livingston has something else planned? Karen's expression darkened. I've had that same nagging feeling. We need to be on our guard, James. Something tells me this is far from over. The tense silence in the courtroom was shattered by the sudden commotion as the bailiff's voice rang out, commanding everyone to remain seated. Order in the court, the judge bellowed, his gavel pounding against the wooden podium. What is the meaning of this interruption? James and Karen exchanged a worried glance as a team of armed security guards burst through the doors, their weapons drawn and their faces etched with a grim determination. Your Honor, the lead guard announced, his voice terse and authoritative. We have reason to believe that there is a credible threat to the safety of the proceedings. As a precautionary measure, we are placing the court under immediate lockdown. The judge's expression darkened, his brow furrowing with concern. A threat? What kind of threat? We've received an anonymous tip that a bomb has been planted somewhere in the building, the guard replied, his gaze sweeping across the stunned faces of the courtroom occupants. For the safety of everyone present, we're initiating a full evacuation and search. Panic erupted in the courtroom as the news sank in, and James felt his stomach twist with dread. He knew in his gut that this was no coincidence. Livingston had to be behind this. This is outrageous, the prosecutor shouted, his face flushed with rage. This is clearly a delaying tactic, and I demand that. I'm afraid I have no choice, counselor, the judge interrupted, his voice weary and resigned. We must take this threat seriously. The court is adjourned until further notice. As the security guards began to usher the terrified occupants out of the building, James and Karen found themselves swept up in the chaos, their minds racing with a mixture of fear and determination. We can't let Livingston get away with this, Karen hissed, her eyes narrowed with a fierce resolve. This has to be her doing, and we need to find a way to expose her. James nodded, his heart pounding in his chest. But how? The place is going to be swarming with security, and we can't exactly waltz back in there and start snooping around. Karen's expression grew thoughtful. Maybe we don't have to. We've got allies in this fight, remember. People who are just as determined as we are to take Livingston down. James felt a glimmer of hope ignite within him. You're right. We need to rally the community, get them to help us find a way back in and uncover the truth. Without another word, the two of them slipped away from the crowd, their minds whirring with a plan. They knew that time was of the essence, and that Livingston's vicious ploy was only the beginning of her desperate attempts to cling to power. As they raced back to the community center, James couldn't help but feel a surge of determination. They had come too far to let Livingston win, and he was willing to do whatever it took to bring her and her corrupt HOA empire crashing down. The community members were already gathered, their faces etched with a mixture of fear and resolve. James and Karen quickly explained the situation, and the crowd erupted into a chorus of outrage and determination. We can't let Livingston get away with this. One of the neighbors shouted, his fist clenched in a gesture of defiance. We need to find a way back into that courtroom and expose her for the fraud that she is. Another neighbor added, her voice trembling with anger. James felt a sense of pride swell within him as he watched his neighbors band together, united in their quest for justice. This was their moment, their chance to finally take back control of their community and reclaim their lives. All right, everyone, he announced, his voice ringing out with a newfound confidence. Let's get to work. We've got a corrupt HOA president to take down. The air was thick with tension as James and Karen led the small group of determined homeowners through the deserted hallways of the courthouse, their footsteps echoing ominously in the eerie silence. After hours of frantic planning and strategizing, they had managed to devise a daring plan to slip past the heavy security presence and find a way back into the courtroom, where they were convinced Livingston was orchestrating her final, desperate attempt to escape justice. All right, remember the plan, Karen whispered, her voice barely audible. We need to move quickly and quietly. Livingston's goons could be anywhere. The group nodded in silent agreement, their faces set with resolute determination. They knew the risks they were taking, but the stakes were too high to back down now. As they approached the entrance to the courtroom, James felt his heart pounding in his chest. He couldn't shake the nagging feeling that they were walking straight into a trap, but he pushed the thought aside, his focus unwavering. Slowly, cautiously, they eased the door open, peering inside. The room was dark and eerily silent, save for the faint sound of muffled voices. There, Karen hissed, gesturing towards a dimly lit corner. I can see Livingston and her lawyer, and, oh my God. James followed her gaze, and his blood ran cold at the sight of the small, inconspicuous device sitting on the table, its red light blinking ominously. A bomb, he breathed, his voice barely above a whisper. Livingston really is behind this. Without a moment's hesitation, the group surged forward, bursting into the courtroom and converging on the device. Livingston and her attorney whirled around, their faces contorted with shock and rage. What is the meaning of this? Livingston screeched, her eyes wild with panic. How dare you interrupt? Save it, Livingston, Karen snapped, her voice dripping with contempt. We know about your little bomb plot. Your game is up. Livingston's expression twisted into a malicious sneer. You fools have no idea what you're up against. This is far from over. Oh, I think it is, James said, his voice steady and resolute. We've got everything we need to expose you and your corrupt HOA for the frauds you are. Suddenly, the sound of sirens echoed through the hallway, and Livingston's eyes widened with a mixture of fear and triumph. It's too late, she hissed, a twisted smile spreading across her face. The authorities are on their way, and by the time they get here, I'll be long gone. Before anyone could react, Livingston and her attorney bolted for the door, disappearing into the chaos. James and Karen exchanged a frantic look, their minds racing with a desperate plan to stop them. "We can't let them get away," Karen cried, already sprinting towards the exit. James hesitated for a moment, his gaze drawn back to the ominous device on the table. He knew they had to act quickly, but he couldn't ignore the looming threat of the bomb. "Karen, wait," he shouted, his voice laced with urgency. "We need to disarm this thing first. Who knows what kind of damage it could do?" Karen paused, her expression torn, but ultimately she nodded in agreement. "All right, let's do it. But we need to hurry. Livingston won't be gone for long." The group converged on the device, their fingers trembling as they carefully examined the intricate wiring. Time seemed to slow to a crawl as they worked, their minds focused on the task in hand. Finally, with a collective sigh of relief, the last wire was cut, and the blinking light flickered and died. They had done it. They had neutralized Livingston's deadly trap, and now it was time to finish what they had started. As the sirens grew louder, James and Karen exchanged a determined look. They knew that the war was far from over, but in this moment they felt a surge of confidence and triumph. Livingston may have escaped, but they had won a crucial battle, and they were more determined than ever to bring her and her corrupt HOA empire crashing down.